you. Well, I'm going to jump in here. And a lot when I hear your stories, just even in brief snippets, that resonates with me. And so I'm excited here to talk a little bit about transitioning into a new leadership role as a person of color. I definitely don't have the market cornered here. There's a lot of people who I've leaned on and have benefited from. And I'm sure there's plenty of wisdom here in the room that I hope to tap into as well. But I thought I'd share a little bit about my story and also just kind of some of the reflections I've had as I think about different transitions. And, I want to make sure I answer time and support people for what they want and need. So I hope we can spend a good chunk of time doing that. But, first days do come in many shapes. And, Honolulu, I certainly, for like you, my first day here at Stanley was in a mask and kind of unusual. And I am grateful to be here on this day, having this conversation on a day when we have our first female vice president and person of color in that role. And that's just incredibly exciting and honoring. And so I had goosebumps. I hope some of you got to watch it today. And I'm grateful this session didn't compete against that because I don't know how people had anyone watching on that day. But yeah, it was an unusual time to come in as a head of school to Stanley. And I was fortunate, I lived in Denver at the time, so I already knew Stanley pretty well. I'd gotten to connect with the school a few times leading up to it, but it didn't mean that it still meant that it was going to be a challenging entry. And it's tough to get to know a place in a pandemic, but I'm grateful we were in person. And I know that's not the case everywhere. But my journey, I've been a department chair, grade level dean, dean of middle school, head of school, and transitioned from different parts of the country. I went to grad school in between Meadowbrook and Alexander Dawson in Colorado, and all incredible communities. And I will speak highly of every school I've been at. I've learned a lot of different places, and each transition to these roles was different. And I think I've learned a lot, and there's definitely some common trends. And I think the biggest thing as I thought about this has been that there are factors that will shape your transition that are in your control, and there are many things that are not in your control. And I think letting go of the things that are not in your control and kind of contextualizing them and embracing them, and then recognizing what is in your control is a really key part to any transition. And so as I think about that, I'll share some stories here. Obviously past events can play a role. I mean, I think about stepping into to a leadership role as division head of school. Maybe there's like a lawsuit that's happened, a student issue that really rocked the community, and that you may know about that past event, you may not know about that past event. And I've had some experiences where I was uncovering, you're uncovering sort of skeletons in the closet, and those are things that are out of your control. But how you embrace them as coming in, these are, I actually find the things that are out of your control, they're great opportunities to show how you respond, because it's not your fault for things that have happened before you, but how you actually manage them and respond to them builds trust. And so I think that's something that you have to be prepared for whenever you come in. No matter how great your interview was or what you thought you knew, there's going to be things in there. The prior leader, that's going to shape how you transition into your school. At Stanley, I am the third head of school in 48 years. I'm the first external person, first person of color, and I love the prior leaders. They're all alive and they're all part of the connected to the school, but it is different coming as an external in a pandemic, and acknowledging and understanding who that person was. He was a parent, he was a teacher here at Stanley, he was a head of middle school at Stanley. It is different, and I don't have those same pieces. He was a white male. I mean, it is different, and I can't pretend to do it his way. And thankfully, I can't do it his way because we're in a pandemic. And I truly hope that none of you have to transition into a new role again in a pandemic, because that is really hard and pulls you in a lot of different ways. But it is liberating in the sense that you can't possibly do things the way someone did it before. As I think about my journey, your personal situation can play a major role. As I think about when I was the dean of middle school at Alexander Dawson, I was in a spot where I professionally and personally, I didn't know what the next step was. And I didn't know if I was going to go national with my search or not. And then I met my wife and I realized I had to explore that. And so that changed my search. And then dominoes fall very quickly. But there was a time when I just didn't know what I wanted to do. And I think I was 30, and just patience and understanding that things will unfold as they unfold and not being too much of a rush. But your personal situation may shift your geography, like in terms of your search. It may shift like what your, where you are in your own personal journey around your own identity, around race, and where you feel comfortable with and what you're looking for. So that's, I think, a really important part to reflect on in terms of your transition to a new place. Where are you personally with this? What are the factors that might guide and shape your choices? Social climate. So, I mean, talk about this summer, like walking in as a new head of school, and Stanley within Denver, especially, is a very racially diverse place. About 38% students of color here in Denver, and we are a school committed to social justice, and to have such energy around just the social climate coming in, and what's our school's response, and trying to speak for that. I think that has influenced this year tremendously. And as a person of color, what's my expectation for leaning into this work, and what's your comfort level with this work? And so we can talk more about that. The leadership structure, every school has different leadership. I come in here and I have a director of operation, I have division heads, we have 3 division heads. We have, some schools are a little smaller. They have, it's a smaller shop. The structure of the leadership is going to be a big role in terms of what your role is, what you're responsible for. And really understanding all of these pieces, I think, are really important. Being an internal head versus an external head, those are all going to be factors that I think are worthwhile giving thought to as you're thinking about your transition. So, as I think about, one of the first things, I know everyone's in different places as the personal front, but I really think knowing yourself as a leader and your story and owning your story is so critical and is oftentimes overlooked. As a leader, especially as you get further up, as a division head, as a head of school, director of missions, who you are as a person does play a role in your, like, just people are interested in learning more about you. They want to know, they want to connect with you. They're dying to hear more about you. And so I think a good question to ask yourself is where are you with your own comfort level about sharing your story? Because people are going to look to hear more about it. And I think it also shapes the interactions. If people have more windows into who you are, part of their engagement with you is also going to be about with who you are, not just about the job you're set to do. I have found that parents and teachers come ask me about things about my own story because I share windows into it. And that's lovely. Like, they're not just like, what's going on with the pandemic? When are our vaccines rolling out? Like, it's nice to have other connection points this year. And I know not everyone's feels the same about different aspects of their identity and what they feel comfortable sharing. But I have found that the more I've been willing to share, I gain back tenfold. And so I share blogs. I talked about my when I was a head of middle school, and my last job, I got married. I had 2 kids. I was sharing photos of my own dad. That's a picture of my dad with the sideburns and the mustache, and just a great photo in general to have that kind of facial hair represented, period. But I share things about it, and that vulnerability, I think, is really appreciated. And people like to know that leaders are human beings too. It probably makes you less likely to be like people I think it's hard to hate up close. I've heard that phrase a lot. When people know a little more about you, they're more willing to understand you as a person. And so I share about my Indian wedding that I had. My wife's white. I'm very candid in the interview process. So people ask what are challenges you have, and I think about being a parent and of a biracial kid, and I don't know what it's like to be biracial. I know what it's like to be Indian, and I fully own that. I have no idea how I'm going to support the growth of my kid. I'll listen and follow him, but I will never ever be able to acknowledge the same experience as him. And I think the more you can communicate through your email blasts or blogs, any windows that feel safe for you, families, traditions that you do in your household, and you can connect these to what's happening in your school very easily around traditions or family. The more we can do those things, I think it just builds connection, and connection builds trust. When people feel like they have a connection to you instead of you're this kind of off in your own lone wolf, I think it's really hard. It's a hard road to go. And so the more you can offer opportunities for people to connect, I think it's going to set you up to feel more connected within your community. And then I also just think it's hard to pretend to be someone you're not. If you're going to go into a leadership role, you want to be your authentic self. And so I've been pretty transparent in my search process about who I am and recognizing that it might not be for everybody. And that's ultimately going to let me be more successful. And I feel grateful at Stanley that I can be my authentic self and share windows into that. So yeah, I mean, I think when you're ready to share, yes, you do that. There's the challenges. I mean, be ready to share, but be ready for well-intentioned but poor attempts at connection. The number of times people will quickly tell me what kind of Indian restaurants they've been to, or like they know somebody who's, they know one person who's Indian, or they ask me if I know somebody who's in Denver who's Indian. They just, there are, you know, 1 out of every 4 people in the world is Indian. So I find it kind of amusing that people might think that I know every single one of them, but I know what it is. It's that attempt at connection, and it speaks volumes to just the idea that the more we can give people windows into us, the more they'll have more organic attempts for connection instead of they'll try to force it. So I don't know if anyone's seen this "Where Are You From" video, what kind of Asian are you? Hopefully you've seen it. But if not, it's just, it's basically this woman who's running, it's a parody, it's a spoof. She talks, someone runs by and says, "What kind of Asian are you?" And he tries to find connections. Like, I know I've had, I forgot, maybe it's like, I've had kimchi, like, and she's Korean. He's like, "Oh, I knew it." Like, it's just people, it's really painful, but it is representative of what I've experienced for sure. People will try to force connections, most of the times well-intentioned, maybe sometimes it's not, but people are, when you're in a leadership role, especially as a head, I've found people are dying to make connections. And so how do we set that up? And then I think be prepared. Your race or parts of your identity are going to be leveraged at times. Like, you're going to be on, if you're, when I was a dean of a middle school, I found that I was like always on these like calendars or like different kinds of admissions videos. Like, it's just, they want to profile you if that's an identity they don't have a lot of. And so it is something that comes with the territory, I think. And there's also some wonderful pieces. I mean, I am shocked at the number of Indian people who keep applying to Stanley now. Like, there's just people from, like, in Denver's not a huge Indian population, but I'm on all these calls and there's Indian people who just keep coming and applying. And I think that can happen as a leader. People see mirrors and they say, "Wow, this is a place for me to be." And that's really wonderful, and a gift you can bring to your community. So I'll pause there. I wanted to kind of let people share, and this is, you know, I obviously these are confidential spaces, but I thought I'd share a couple of questions here and see, you know, how do people feel about what I'm just kind of talking about? How are you feeling about your own aspects of your identity, and have you done that? Have you been able to share any windows into who you are with your community and your work through communications? Are there holdups or things that you wonder? And how do you, and then also, how do you navigate the wonders and microaggressions that invariably arise as a person of color, as an educator? So both ends, and I think they're inevitable. So I'll pause here and maybe take us off here, my screen share, and just open the floor to see if anyone has any reflections or shares anything that resonates with them about what I said at that point.
I'll go because I have to go soon to a Zoom with my students. But thank you so much for sharing what you've shared so far. For me, one thing that resonates was my experience giving a chapel talk at my school. Chapel or giving talks is part of our tradition at our school, and I had to be like coaxed into doing it. I was asked and asked again to do it, and afterwards I found it to be a very like affirming opportunity and experience. But I think given this past year with the global pandemic, and also some of the things that I've been noticing in the virtual space, I've like really tried to zip it in more and try to like decrease my digital footprint because I'm uncomfortable about like on a moral scale, how much is out there. And so I guess I'm like, I'm heartened to hear that you think that like it could be a positive thing to have a blog and put more things out there about my life. But I'm also kind of weighing that against how much I kind of don't want to do that, if that makes sense.
Mine's a professional blog. Like when I put out for the school, I'm not doing things that I'm not showing every personal life detail, but it is something I try to look at through the lens of the school. But yeah, I mean, I that's certain, your comfort level with the digital footprint is part of it. Again, as a leader, your footprint increases whether you like it, unfortunately, or not. But I certainly respect that.
I think some of it, it's interesting because I'm presenting next week, actually, a workshop on stories and healing. And some of what I find so interesting, so at Woodhull, we have a communications program where we're constantly asking our boys to be vulnerable and share of themselves. So we have to model it. But what I found in the associate head role is, in order to be effective, I've had to kind of help the team here learn how to do that vulnerable work by making myself vulnerable. And coming in and being the only person of color at first, well, only Black male at first on the team, there was this dynamic of kind of, all right, I'm going to delve in and we're going to lean into this and we're going to do this work. But it was beautiful to watch. By me modeling the vulnerability, they jumped into the vulnerability, but really setting that ground floor and that groundwork of like, we got to do this without judgment, because I know you guys are going to make mistakes. And I know you're going to come up to me and talk to me about basketball. Newsflash, sang opera, know nothing about basketball. So I'm just putting that out there on the get-go so we avoid that awkwardness and move on. And it's a really empowering thing when the team can do that and learn how to do it. But it takes work. But I really appreciate you putting that reminder to share a piece of yourself with each other, because I think some of what makes leadership inadequate in so many of our schools is that isn't promoted, and we lose that level of humanity when what are we doing as educators? Trying to pour into the soul of the youth that we're mentoring, and what do we need for that vulnerability, So thank you for going there and reminding us to share the piece of ourselves, because that's also how you embed yourself in the culture, mission, and philosophy of the school.
Thank you, Vince.
I appreciate all that you've shared, and it's, for me, it's always a balance, having been a student at these schools, so, extends beyond, like 30, 40 some odd years. So for me, it's always like an odd balance of how much do you permit yourself to be harmed. But I do appreciate, like, acknowledging that some poor attempts are attempts at connection, even though they are poor, and just understanding, taking it for what it is, even though, you have years and decades of like, like, wow, this is really, I'm really tired, so I think it's helpful to hear you say that, and hear your spin on it. Because I think that's important when you're moving into spaces where you still may be like the only one, even though they may be working on their diversity work. That's definitely something you have to endure, I think, for a while.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on being ready to share, but ... What if the interviewer is asking you about your story? So for example, a couple of years ago, I had a dean of students ask me, what's your nationality? I know that's not legal. You're not supposed to ask those sort of questions, but I was caught off guard. And I mentioned that, I'm an American nationality, right? Ethnically Vietnamese, but born in Thailand. And then when I mentioned Vietnamese, he's like, oh yeah, I have a Vietnamese student on scholarship and they're not doing so well. And so like, how do you navigate that sort of response, right? And comment, and then do you bring it up to the head of school while you're interviewing? It's so tricky. So I'm curious about your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think so there's like the human reaction. So when I have if I have a comment like that that's made to me, I know I sometimes struggle with my poker face, and I wish I had a better one at times, but I tend to try to do something that buys me a little more time. So I'm like, oh, like I'll just say, oh, can you tell me more about that student? Or I'll just try to ask a question that takes the spotlight off of me, so I can just, let my breathing like get back to its normal self and listen more, and then try and in doing that, I also get a little bit more information. Where is this person coming from? And give me, because sometimes people just say things that just comes out of their mouth. Again, they're trying to be a connection, and it's, again, terribly poor attempts, but they are genuinely intending to be well. And then there are other times when it genuinely is not that case. And so I think listening more, providing, giving opportunities, and it's not easy. The more, I mean, I'm sure you've seen like the microaggressions mosquito analogy video, where like some people just get bit a lot more by mosquitoes than other people, and some people get microaggressions more and more, and you might be able to take a certain number. And so as who you are, where you are in your life at this time in terms of how you're ready to handle it, does drive this a little bit. And so being prepared to understand, where are you, how are you going to handle it when it happens? And then it's also part of the picture of, the school overall. Is this a pattern of people that you're noticing in the interview process? What's the culture like here? So I think I'm listening, I'm taking notes. I try my best to show up positively as much as I frequently can. I know there are times when I've hit my load and I can't do it anymore. But I try to be proximate. I try to get closer to people. I try to do my best to support people. And then, if you end up in that job, like it's something that you're taking notes of, and you're like, okay, how do I go about, is this a systemic cultural issue, or is this an individual issue? And if it's an individual, like, is that person the right person on the bus? And what's that professionalism like? And how can you fall back on things that are kind of group norms are important. So it depends on the nature of position you're kind of stepping into, when you have that trust of the person who might be out of school and has the power. But it's a really crappy way to experience a first look at a school. I'm gonna jump back in here and Hanali, oh, sorry, Hanali, did you want to share something? I'm sorry. Okay. So, hang on. Stop share. All right. So I think as we think about the first part has to begin with yourself, like knowing where you are as an individual as you're doing this search process. And I spent a lot of time, and again, as I was going through the head search process, understanding what do I feel comfortable sharing, how can I be vulnerable and acknowledge it. And I'll just say, if any of you are thinking about the head search process, like really don't underestimate the importance of that vulnerability, because it is about connection. I often believe once you're a finalist, it's less about like your experience, whether it's the division head job, less about like whether people think you're capable of the job. It's more about how you come off as a person and whether you have connection. It's dating in so many ways. And so not feeling like you have to defend yourself as a person of color. I think that's a privilege that white males tend to have. They don't ever think about having to defend whether they're qualified enough for the job. If you're as a finalist, don't second guess yourself. Don't spend time wondering, oh, do I have to walk in and like really prove that I'm the best at this, and this, or I deserve to be here? Focus on being yourself and being that person, because that personal connection is really what the difference is, in my opinion, in that process. And so I wouldn't lose sight of that. Knowing your school is really critical. That you're jumping into as you think about the search process. Every school's in a different spot. And I think pretending like, if you're passionate, let's say you came from, I don't know, like if you came from like a school like Georgetown Day, which has like a very big different racial composition and has a certain philosophical approach, and maybe has been doing diversity work for many years, and you go to a school that's just starting its work, these are different places. Like, don't pretend like they need to be in the same spot. And I think coming in with the mindset of meeting a school where they are and being proud of the growth that you can help it get to, it is, if we can start thinking about that. I've been when I was at Meadowbrook, Dawson, St. Anne's, each place is at a different spot. And I've learned that when I don't just assume that every school should be at the same spot, and this is, if we talk about kids, it's the same metaphor. Like, not all kids are in the same spot. We shouldn't pretend they're in the same spot. So let's understand and listen to where they truly are. And then you won't skip steps in terms of building a culture of what you're trying to do and grow. And so really moving past where a school should be, like, oh my gosh, this school doesn't have a diversity director, doesn't have like affinity groups, or doesn't do this, it doesn't do that. And just thinking about, okay, this is where they are. Why are they where they are? It might be different than what I thought I was walking into, but it is where they are. And you're now in this role, and what can you do to meet them where they are to help them grow? And all of us, I think it's nice to think about like our impact on a place, and that no place can ever be the same when we leave it. But we need to know that these schools are going to endure well beyond our time. And there is something to be contributing to a school for that stage of its evolution. And in some stages might require a little bit more input and less output. Like you might be in a stage where like the school is like building a foundation around DEI work, and you're laying the groundwork there. It's not the visible transformation yet, but you're building the culture, and that takes a lot of energy. But then you head off somewhere else, and the school's able to continue that growth, and that's a huge gift to the school. As I think about my time at St. Anne's, which is a wonderful place, when I started there, we didn't have a DEI director. Our students of color percentage was much lower. And I thought a lot about like, who are the people we need to get together? What are sort of the vision and mission? How can I create a plan? Like, what are sort of the founding parts? And if I can do that, I'm going to set the school up to be in a different place than when I left it, in a better hands than when I got it. And I think I'm walking to Stanley, and Stanley is a very different place. And, we've got way more students of color. We're doing all these different things. I have to actually like pump the brakes on different initiatives and it's just different. And there's other things that on other fronts and around curriculum, maybe that we need to do more work of. And so as you walk into schools, while it's nice to have aspirations about where we want everything to be, we should have them, but we can't lose sight about where they are, where schools truly are. Because if we miss that, we're going to try to like grow it in a way that won't work. And so leaning on the mission, the vision, the value, strategic plan, I think one of the things I've learned a lot is it's not about me as a leader. It's about the founding things that are that are non-negotiables. What are the things that everyone agreed on? You're here for the mission, you're here for the values. It's not Sumant's ideas. This is the mission. This is what the values say. This is what the strategic plan says. This is what the DEI strategic plan says. Here are some data and feedback. This is the results of the self-study. How do you lean on all of those pieces so it's not, as a person of color especially, you're not going to have this be tethered as much to you as a person of color. You're actually you're leaning on things that everyone who signed up for is in agreement on. And I think that's really key to understand your school, because that'll help you be able to advance things. And then knowing who was in the role before you will help shape your understanding of how change happens and change management is run, and where people have been burned before. I've been in like situations this year where I'm trying to think about launching certain experiences, and people will talk about how, there wasn't transparency at this point or before, or like, and those are things you inherit. And so how do you listen for those pieces and help shape how you lead? Because if there's no point in being blind to it. And then what events have shaped the school you're entering? As I mentioned earlier, are there big major events? Is there a student who was expelled that was very controversial? Is there a major lawsuit? What are the things that have shaped the school and the culture? Because you need to be aware of them, because they're gonna creep up in some capacity. And then gaining clarity in the roles and responsibilities for your work. So what I say about it is like, what is your role as a leader in X initiative? And I've talked a lot about DEI work, we're people of color on this call. And I don't mean to say that's the only thing that we do, obviously, but it is something that I think that happens a lot. And it's certainly something I'm passionate about. And so one thing I actually spent time on doing was looking out at our diversity, equity, inclusion mapping, like how is the work done at Stanley? And we actually had a new board committee at Stanley that was super excited about leading DEI work. And they had a map like this, but it actually was involved. It actually had this green board committee at the center, pointing with arrows to like all these different groups and work. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about redesigning this and what are the roles of everybody, so people feel clear in what their work is. what is my role as a head of school in supporting each of these groups and helping them in this area? And so what we're, I think, understanding the roles and responsibilities for whether it's on a curricular initiative, whether it's on DEI work, whether it's on a different outreach, really understanding who's in what lane and whose work this is and where you're excited about helping support it, because then you're not trying to bite off more than you can chew. You'll understand the different dynamics of individuals. But I think it's worth mapping sort of what are the kinds of roles that exist in this work? How do I fit into the puzzle in my current position? So I don't know, I'd love to hear, like, as you think, I'd love people to share anything that as they think about different initiatives that they have they leaned on any kinds of mission, vision, or self-study? Any examples they can share and point to? And making it less about them, but rather the work or things that the school agrees on?
So I think piggybacking on the diversity side of things, our head of school here is new. He's been here a year and a half. He's from England, so not from the U.S., but also not a POC leader. But his perspective, I think the diversity in perspective, I think is something that he's brought in that's been different. He was the first non-local hire the school has had in that anybody here can remember, and I was the second. So having the outside perspective of not knowing what the historical context and makeup of our school and of the community is, we are in an area that is affluent, and the students at our school, a lot of them don't leave the area, and so a lot of the initiatives we have is diversifying not only our student body but our faculty and staff first, through recruitment and looking at how do we do that in a different way, so that when students come here and tour, students of color come and check out what's going on here, they don't feel like complete strangers and completely uncomfortable in what that looks like. And so that looks at a lot of different ways for us as a school. Some of it is me jumping on things like this and just trying to see what everyone else is doing, but also just not being shy, going back to the last conversation about sharing who you are. I don't have a problem sharing who I am, and sometimes the opposite happens with me as a push, as far as growing up in Hawaii and working at a school in Hawaii with a very diverse population and mostly Native Hawaiian students out there. I don't shy away from talking about students. The other part that's interesting about me is I'm white enough to pass as the white guy, which is totally fine. At the same time, shocking for some people when I bring up my Hawaiian, Chinese, Native American, and all kinds of other nationalities that come from my ancestors and talk about it that way. So it's interesting to stand up in front of a group of individuals who are nervous about that conversation. I make a joke to everyone, like, I wish I could be the Kool-Aid man and just kind of bust through the wall and just say, hey, let's talk, but there's a sensitivity to that, because I don't want them to think that every time I come into a room, I'm looking for a confrontation and for everyone to put their guts on the table type thing. So with our DEI stuff that we're doing, the group that we have, there are some who are very interested in learning more about it, kind of a peripheral type individuals. And then there's others who are passionate about one thing. And one thing that we're working on right now, a couple members of our DEI committee, they're so committed to taking us from conservative thought process as far on the liberal side, going from right to left in an extreme nature, that I think is causing them to really understand that diversity and inclusion, it requires you to be okay with both sides of everything. And I think that just because there is some bigotry and some comments that are made that are not necessarily appropriate, that doesn't mean that you dismiss everybody else's conservative values or historical context. And so that's an initiative that I think we're wrestling with, as far as how much do we push on that side, and make sure that our faculty and staff are comfortable with those conversations, but not to monopolize it, to make it their own thing, as opposed to identifying and supporting kind of diverse student and faculty backgrounds and opinions. So that's tough for us right now.
Yeah. And as a person of color, I think it's easy to get trapped into like, you should be like, are you always talking about DEI work? It's something I'm certainly sensitive to. And how do you build your team to have other voices leading it? And then I'm trying to be very intentional about what I write about and how I write about different things and communicate. So it's not always linked with one piece, because that's where people will jump to your point. Other thoughts or comments? All right. Well, I'm going to open up in a couple minutes just to have like, just if there's other things people want to talk about, whether it's search process or things like that. But I think another part that I think is important to keep in mind is, as a person of color, I think it's really valuable as an educator to have your networks. And I go around collecting mentors in every space that I go. I try to learn from people, whether it's NAIS, when I was at Columbia in my master's, the Asian Educators Alliance is a great space for me. The Association of Colorado Independent Schools is wonderful. And I think it's good to really understand that, have your network of educators that you talk to outside of your school, but don't fall into the trap of replacing the conversations you need to have internally with that outside person. And so I have an executive coach. It was something that I put into my contract when I signed, and she's fabulous. She's a person of color, has been a long time head, and I talked with her, and I told her at the beginning, I said, make sure that you're always reminding me to go back to my own community and have the conversations with my admin team, my board, and things like that, because otherwise, sometimes you're having these conversations, you think you're having these conversations, and well, I'm moving forward with some of these things, but actually you haven't had them with the people who need to have them. And it also can make you really lonely if you're only having these conversations outside of that space. And certainly I can appreciate that you have to deal with what feels comfortable. But I guess what I'm just sort of saying is be wary of only having this outside group. If you feel like you're the only person, find areas that you can find common ground with certain people. You might disagree with them on certain things, but maybe there's places where you can agree with them on certain areas that are important to you. And so have your network, have people you can connect to and reach out on the phone and talk to. But make sure that you're doing the work in your own school with those people and building relationships and making time for them, because that's what's going to help you advance and grow your school. And that's what's going to help people see you in a different way when you're able to spend time. And I think in a pandemic right now, I'm certainly sensitive to the fact that, gosh, like people don't know me. I mean, I was at a school for 6 years and everyone knew me really well. And I'm entering a school where I've got masks on most of the day. And so really building those connections now, making time for kids and people, the handwritten notes, all those pieces, that there's never enough that we can do when we transition well, because that's all about building the well for people and gaining trust. And that's the number one thing I think in a leadership role. Pacing yourself. I think once you get the job, it's super exciting and you have all these ideas and you're like, oh man, I could take the school here and there. And again, the number one thing is relationships, building your team, understanding where the strengths are, who's got leadership potential in different areas. The more you can find that piece and focus on people first when you transition, then it's not going to be just about you doing some of this work. It's really about supporting the team. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, meeting the school where it is, invest in the groundwork needed for different initiatives. What is if there's a lack of clarity in terms of why we're doing this work, focus on the why first. If there's not the resources for an initiative to be launched, it's not going to be successful by just trying to dive into it. Make sure you're auditing sort of who you have, the human resources, the financial resources, the why. Do you have the time to launch this? In a pandemic, it's hard to take on different initiatives, and that really bothers me because I like to affect change. I like to take on different things, but make sure you've got all those different components. Otherwise, your initiative won't be successful as a head or as a division head or as a leader. And so make sure you've got that piece and you're spending time gaining buy-in. All those components really help set up something for success. So pace yourself because schools are slower moving ships, but if you spend the time on the front end, and create the culture, you're really going to be more likely to be successful and make things move more quickly, I believe. And then what you think might be urgent might not turn out to be. What you've been told might be urgent when you get in the seat might be discovered not to. I remember when I was at St. Anne's, I had a whiteboard and I had this parking lot of ideas. And I really wanted to do student-led conferences. It was something very simple. And like at my current school, that was already there. But student-led conferences was a goal. I really believed in the importance of them. And I just never had that like 5.5 years later, I didn't have that opportunity. And it just so happened that like, as I was on the way out, like because of the pandemic, we actually chose to utilize student-led conferences as an opportunity. And I finally got to that, but that was something that I thought was really important initially and I wanted to do, but it didn't happen. And then there was other things that kind of, I didn't think might've been bigger deals and they became more pressing and around DEI work. And so being prepared to like, listen. When I got to Stanley, I spent over the summer, I met with every single faculty staff member, asked them questions, got to know them as a person. So they had any kind of relationship with me, knowing that they had known the prior head for 13 to 25 years. Just you'll get a window into what things come up and that might help you understand what's urgent, but then you may get in the seat and discover there's a pandemic. And so great, you got to deal with the things that are urgent. And then I think coming in is always hard as a leader and as a person of color can be challenging. So find the things that bring you joy. Like what are the parts of school day that you can still be involved in, even if you've got X role. There's no shortage of things that are hard about being a leader. And so, if it's throwing a football outside with somebody, with kids, if it's reading to kids, if it's just being in the classroom more, whatever you can do that brings you joy. Especially this year in a pandemic, I have found that's so important to keep yourself sustained in this first year, especially. And then because taking care of yourself, it's definitely been a marathon and it will be a marathon this year for all of us as we look at the second half of this year. But I think the only other thing I would say is one, I'm so grateful that people are here in this room, that like we have people of color who continue to want to be leaders and keep growing. I have benefited as a person of color who've had people who've encouraged me to become a head of school, and it is the best job. I am so thrilled about this role. The ability to affect change and work across domains is so wonderful, and I'm happy to help support people in this process as they think about just how do you navigate the head search process or anything like that. Again, I'm not an expert, but I can share my own experiences on that front because I do really like helping people, and it's helped me. I've had so many people help me in my journey, and I'm deeply committed to paying it forward. So I don't know if there's anything that people want to talk about. I'm open. We got 10 minutes here. What would be valuable? What's on people's minds?
So I am making that transition from Director of Enrollment Management. I've been doing admissions since 2003, been in independent school since 1999. And I've submitted applications for an assistant principal / assistant head.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what I don't know. So any recommendations would be super helpful in making that jump, if you will.
Yeah, I think one of the best piece of advice that I got that has shifted my thinking in the interview process has been about rather than try to like make a list of 50 questions of things that you need to memorize an answer for, really think back to your experience. What are the challenging situations you've been in? Really try to unpack all the stories and examples and ways you've affected change, leadership initiatives. If you can focus on all of those pieces and then reflect on your story, what you've learned from it, so that as you're going into this process and people are asking you questions, there's going to be situations where you have an experience that's very relevant and you can talk to it, use your story and speak about what you've done. And I would say, and then in terms of like when you have something that people ask that you don't know. So if the assistant head role is going to be, and gosh, assistant head of school roles vary tremendously in terms of what their purview is. So really understanding what each assistant head of school job is it focusing more on operations? Is it focusing more on enrollment, on some of the bigger levers? Is it more just, are you just the second person? Are you focusing on development? I mean, it just depends on the size of the school and where they're at. So I feel like it's always important to be transparent, know the things that you're good at, and then things that you don't have as much experience, you can say, yeah, that's an area that I don't have as much experience in, but here, let me tell you about how I'm planning on going about doing it. So for me, finance, I hadn't had a whole lot of experience in finance as I applied for this job, but I was grateful that my head of school let me sit on the finance committee meetings leading up to it. But I got to be honest, I don't know if I really understood what the heck they were talking about in the finance committee meetings. Everyone's using all this language and vernacular that I can't pretend to know. And I was in the room. What I absorbed, I don't know. I mean, I'm an economics major, but I certainly wasn't an expert. And you don't need to be an expert to be in these roles, but you can show your commitment to learning. You can ask good questions. And I think there's something really important about being able to say, you know what, I don't know, I don't have all the answers, but I do know how to ask good questions. And I'm not afraid to ask them, because if you're willing to ask questions and pause, there's probably somebody else who is thinking the same thing in the room, I found. And so I, as the head of school in these finance meetings, I sit there and I'm like, you know, I'm sorry, everyone knows this. I stopped apologizing actually at this point. I just say, can somebody please translate what was just said? Like, I don't even know what those terms mean. And people are like, oh yeah, sure. Because there's all these people who are working for, you know, banks and have a different language. So don't be afraid to acknowledge what you don't know. And then I guess the answer would be, if you found that there's like 10 things that they ask you about in terms of your experience, you don't, and you're like, I don't know how that experience. Well, then go find those experiences that you need and try to find ways to get involved. And you don't have to be an expert to get in the game. I think you got to have some exposure, and then you got to be just thoughtful about process. So.
That's very helpful. I mean, I know for me, I'm going into this, I have Katsana, I have the same background, enrollment management, transitioning to an assistant head is my goal. And so, I mean, I had the benefit of working in a small school, and because of that, you know, you end up doing a lot of everything. So I just, over the years have had, I think, more experiences than I would have if I were in a larger school, isolated to just doing enrollment management. But at the same time, it's like you have an awareness and knowledge, but I wasn't actually, it was like out of my purview. So it wasn't as though I was doing it per se. So, and I just think, that transition of trying to demonstrate that you have, you know, that you can ask good questions and that you have an awareness of the process, I think is, and I think also demonstrating some presence, that you can demonstrate presence of being able to make those decisions when you need to and understand process. I think that's, there are times when I feel much more confident about that, and other times where I feel a bit more, you know, unsure, a little more reluctant. And so just how do you get through that process when you're doing the interview?
Yeah. And the research shows that people of color are constantly aware of their shortcomings, like they
Right.
don't, in ways that white people are not. And so, and that is really challenging. We have to, it's okay. Like, no one has all the things figured out, but if you're a hard worker, you're willing to ask good questions, you build relationships, you go back to what you know, and then you're committed, you can just speak to how, what you've done in similar examples. Like if it's about change management, like, okay, let me tell you about how I've implemented some change in admissions. I can't say it specifically, but I worked in teams. I relied on the why. I've been thoughtful. I've gotten feedback. Like a lot of these things are very similar. And then, you know, just in terms of growing your own understanding about other departments, like just making time to talk with, you know, if you're in admissions, my hunch is the areas that people will want to know, like, do you have blind spots in or on student life? And they'll want to know, like, leadership, like academic leadership, how are you going to manage those things?
Right.
So, you know, academic leadership, you don't have to know everything about all the different curriculum, but you do need to know how to work with people, which I'm sure you know how to do in your current role. Like all you do in admissions is work with people.
It's true.
And so, and that's really what, like, the higher up in leadership, it's more about supporting people. It's listening to them. It's meeting them where they are. It's providing a space. It's sharing what you've been hearing. And then it's being intentional about continuing to move forward, having accountability. And you can speak to those things and you can acknowledge, you know what, I don't have a ton of experience in this, but I do have experience growing X. I have experience working with people. Let me tell you about a challenging situation I had to deal with here. And I think that really, the humility is something that actually is a strength. And the moment I started the moment I stopped thinking about trying to be defensive and say, yeah, let me tell you about why I'm so great. I promise you I can do the job. The moment I lost that and focused more on, I know I can do the job. I'm here because people believe I can do it. I'm now it's just about that person piece. Like, who am I? Do I understand the things I can't do? Am I willing to ask for help and lean on the team and trust the people who should be doing that job? Because I don't, in so many ways, like, I don't actually have a job. I don't know, like I need to make sure and support people in doing their jobs. And that, so it's kind of liberating once you can get past that, but it's not easy to always do. And so that's been the biggest growth for me, I found.
That's helpful. Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
So I'm also curious about, I know we're running out of time, but like, how do you build that team? So, your immediate team of people that you feel like you have the trust you need to ensure that you're going to be successful. Like, what was that process like for you?
Yeah, so there's the team you inherit, and then there's every opportunity you have to hire is the most important thing. You spend hours and hours and hours, and then you're also trying to recruit at every moment. Like, you all will hopefully become heads of schools, and I will never have the opportunity to hire you, but I hope that I would be trying to recruit people at every single opportunity and avenue that I'm in, because I want to speak for what I believe in. I want to speak for what my school stands for, and I want to keep raising awareness. And so I think you got to think about what are the qualities that you're trying to have when you're in hiring committees. You do anti-bias work. You try to figure out, how do we get the people we want to get in? You find the mission aligned, and then you find people who are process driven. And you have to be part of the higher up you are, the more opportunity you have to build your team, for sure. But it is really, it's slow work. It's slow work. And then it's also the ones who aren't necessarily aligned with you. You find the common ground with them to build their trust. And then you can ask them to do things that are harder for them later. Like, I think about it in my other school, there was a teacher who was just extremely challenging to work with, very entrenched in his ways. And it took me multiple years to celebrate him. And I dealt with his complaints about many things over and over again. And he wrote me the greatest note afterwards when I took this new job. He's like, we didn't always see eye to eye, but you truly saw me for my strengths. And I appreciate all the ways you helped me get through the pandemic and do online classes. And it just, when you spend time with people, you honor them for what they like to do. And then you guide them and you meet them where they are, to even move them from here to here. And that gets them closer to on your team. And there's some you'll come in, you can move them from here to here, but moving the ones that are slower, even a little bit, helps. And then celebrating the heck out of them for successes makes them become part of your team. But the easiest way is to hire somebody, right?
Well, thank you very much. This has been really very helpful.
I
might have to drop you an email.
Yeah, and please put that email here. I love talking, because I learned so much just from everybody else and their experiences. So I wish you all the best. Most importantly, thank you for what you're doing for kids and your schools. What a crazy time. I'm just grateful that we have people leading this work, and I'm grateful that we have people of color who are doing this work, because the world needs us now more than ever, for sure. So
thank you.
Thank you.
the best.
Thank you. Take care, guys.
You
Thank
too.
you.